Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar on planning for NDC implementation, a quick start guide. My name is Claire Monkhouse and I work for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. I support the delivery of our Africa programme and lead on our NDC portfolio. CDKN, for those who don't know us, is a 7-year initiative funded by UK Department for International Development and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we work to support decision makers in designing and delivering climate compatible development by combining research, advisory services and knowledge management. And we do this by working in partnership with decision makers in public, private and non-governmental sectors at the national, regional and international level. I'm delighted to be joined with James Harries. He's a Principal Technical Consultant from Ricardo Energy and Environment, and he's one of the key authors of the guide. We're also expecting Stephen Kinguyu to join us from the Kenyan Climate Change Directorate. He's also the co-chair of the LEDS GP. Hopefully he'll be able to dial in shortly and provide some remarks. Welcome James. So I'm going to introduce the guide and then I'll hand over to James who will take you through it in much more detail. Hopefully then we'll hear from Stephen about how the NDC is being implemented in Kenya. After this we're going to take questions from participants, so thank you to those who have sent questions through in advance. If you'd like to send questions in throughout the webinar, please do so by using the little questions box that's on the corner of your screen, and James and I will do our best to answer as many of those in the time that we have available. So I just wanted to start by kind of positioning why we developed the Quick Start Guide. Obviously the adoption of the Paris Agreement was a huge moment, and central to that was the intended nationally determined contributions. But the challenge now is turning these intended contributions into real actions on the ground. So after Paris, we started to hear from our networks that there was a real need for practical guidance to help countries get going with NDC implementation. So when we first started considering developing this guidance, we wanted to understand a little bit more about this. How were developing country governments feeling about NDC implementation? What were the main challenges that they were being faced with? We therefore reached out to our CDKN global network and other contacts through Ricardo, etc. And actually we heard that for many countries these challenges aren't entirely new. So although the NDC process is a new process, the efforts to connect climate and development are not new in themselves. So the challenges that you'll see here up on the screen won't be kind of new to you. They're things that have been experienced before. So if I just quickly go through them: awareness and political buying. So the need for and the benefits of approaching climate and development planning together, how you raise awareness of that and get buy-in across government of the benefits of doing so. The data, having the right evidence in place to inform and engage capacity. So have we got the right resources in place across government? Governance and coordination. How in practice do you integrate climate change into national planning and development processes? Governance. Having the right effective systems in place to coordinate, and importantly how you do that at a subnational level and also a sectoral level. Engaging others, an ongoing challenge, and how you do that inside and outside of government. Resources, and this is having the resources in place not just from international sources but also domestic resources, but also having the ability to disperse funds. And then finally the measurement of progress, having the systems in place so you can see that you're on track and being able to feed that back into the planning processes. And of course wrapped around all of this is the challenge that a lot of the detail around NDCs and the Paris Agreement is still being negotiated. So in response to this, we started to develop the Quick Start Guide, and that was in response to this kind of need for early practical guidance. The guide aims to support policymakers in developing countries, but equally it can be applied in developed countries, we feel. Also to support development partners and practitioners working with governments on planning for NDC implementation. It's published online and in hard copy as a guide and a reference manual, and that includes a step-by-step approach to NDC development and delivery. It includes activities that countries can work through, and it also includes over 20 case studies so that there can be shared learning from other countries across those different aspects. And James will say more about that shortly. The way that it's structured, it is to kind of recognise and acknowledge that countries are at different stages. You can't, for example, pick the guide up and work from page 1 to page 50 and then have an NDC implementation plan. It's designed in such a way that you can dip in and out of it and use the parts of it that are most helpful to you at a particular point in time. We've also aimed to make connections with broader development objectives throughout the guide, in particular the Sustainable Development Goals, and making connections to a country's own existing plans and processes. The guide was developed by a team of authors in CDKN and Ricardo Energy Environment, and it very much built on guidance we developed before Paris on developing INDCs. We also had extensive input and peer review from CDKN's global network of in-country advisors, so the people that we work with who are on the ground in the countries that we work in for CDKN in Africa, Asia and Latin America. Similarly, Ricardo has a team of experts who have experience of working in different countries, and we also reached out to experts from WRI, GIZ, UNDP, UNFCCC and others to ensure that what we were developing was the right kind of guidance, and it was the guidance that was going to be helpful for users. We've shared this thinking at Bonn with the LEDs partners and in UNDP regional dialogues. So finally, we published the guide in October last year, and we're now piloting it in Kenya, Uganda and Zambia, and we hope that we can share the results back from those pilot projects in round about June time this year. So I'll hand over to James now, who will explain more about the guide and how it can be used in practice.
Great, thanks Claire. So the Quick Start Guide is built around Ricardo Energy and Environment's NDC implementation framework, and this framework that we developed in late 2015 before the Paris Climate Conference consists of 5 distinct but linked modules, and you can see them on the screen now. So firstly we have mitigation and the need for actions and measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then secondly we have adaptation and the need for putting in place actions to strengthen climate resilience. And obviously there are synergies between the two in the sense that a number of measures can deliver both mitigation and adaptation benefits. Third, we have monitoring, reporting and verification, or MRV, which is all about understanding the implementation and impacts of the mitigation and adaptation actions. Fourth, we have the finance module, which is all about providing the financial support to implement mitigation and adaptation actions. And lastly, we have governance, which is all about putting in place appropriate institutional structures and processes to drive forward NDC implementation and to encourage political buy-in. So the Quick Start Guide is split into 2 main sections. There's the guide itself, which is about 20 pages long, and then there's a more detailed accompanying reference manual. So looking at the guide itself, this sets out the overall NDC implementation process and considers the 3 main steps for implementing an NDC. Step 1 is preparatory work, and this involves firstly submitting the first NDC to the UNFCCC, but it could also include consideration of key strategic questions such as what the scope of the NDC implementation plan should be, what time frame it should cover, how it should integrate with other existing structures and processes, and what the status of the plan should be. The second key step is developing the NDC implementation plan. This includes a gap analysis to understand what's already been done in country and what the next steps might therefore be. It involves an assessment of the resource needs for carrying out the NDC implementation activities. It also includes a sequencing of activities to understand what are the priority short-term activities and what are the more medium and long-term activities. And it also involves just documenting the plan, so turning this all into some kind of NDC implementation plan or roadmap. And then step 3 is actually delivering the plan, and that involves coordinating the climate actions for mitigation and for adaptation, building capacity for NDC implementation, engaging with stakeholders, and also starting to think about updating the NDC in the run-up to 2020. The accompanying reference manual gives a lot more detail, and it is structured around the 5 modules that I set out in the previous slide. So for each module, the reference manual lists a series of activities that might be relevant for a country to implement the NDC. And you can see for each module there is a diagram such as the one in the bottom of the screen here that shows these activities that are read from the bottom upwards as indicated by the arrow. And the diagram also shows color-coded dots to indicate where certain activities link across to different modules. So each module of the reference manual includes this table or list of activities, as well as relevant excerpts from the Paris Agreement, case studies to show how other countries have tackled these issues, and also links to Sustainable Development Goals. So the Quick Start Guide can be used in a number of ways and also by a number of different stakeholders. So firstly, it can obviously be used to inform the development of some kind of NDC implementation document. So this could be an NDC implementation plan or roadmap. It could be sectoral plans, or it could include both. It can also be used to carry out the gap analysis that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so this can be done by going through each module and basically working through the list of activities for each module, thinking about what's already been done, thinking about what hasn't yet been done and should therefore be part of the NDC implementation plan. But it can also help countries think about activities that have been started maybe but haven't been finished, or even activities that have been done but could be improved upon. Third, the Quick Start Guide could potentially be used to scope out terms of reference for technical assistance requests. So once an NDC implementation plan or roadmap has been developed, it will essentially provide a shopping list of activities to be carried out to implement the NDC. And these could either individually or packaged together be turned into projects for technical assistance for the country. So the guide in this sense could potentially be used by development partners and donors as well as the countries themselves. The guide can also be used to identify the capacity building and resource needs for carrying out the different activities to implement the NDC. And it can also be used to start some early thinking about options for updating the NDC in future. So I'm now going to just work through each of the 5 modules in turn and just try and give you a flavour of what each module covers. So in the time available it won't be possible to go into this in great detail, but hopefully it will give you a sense of the kind of content that is contained within each module. So we start off with governance, and really it's no coincidence that governance is the first one we address in the reference manual. It really is critical, and it can be considered the glue that really holds together the rest of NDC implementation. So what do we mean by governance? Well, it can mean a number of things. Partly it's about effectively driving forward progress from the centre and ensuring strong and effective coordination of NDC implementation. On the other hand, it also means empowering others to act. So in many countries it will be the Environment Ministry that might be the lead institution for climate change and for NDC implementation, and yet other ministries, transport, agriculture, industry, are likely to be the ones that hold the policy levers for actually delivering that. And all of that will be done through effective institutional structures and processes. Another important aspect of governance is political will, because you can have all the governance structures in the world, but without political will at the highest levels, it will be difficult to take forward NDC implementation. And lastly, governance is also about being an inclusive and transparent process and involving stakeholders from various different sectors. So the activities set out in the governance module are set out in the diagram at the bottom of the screen. The first activity at the bottom is around setting up an NDC focal point. So this would involve identifying where the focal point will be, defining their roles and responsibilities, agreeing cooperation approaches with other key institutions, and ensuring sufficient resources for that focal point team. The next activity is setting up the institutional arrangements for NDC implementation, and importantly thinking about how these might be integrated with existing processes and structures. The next activity is building capacity. So partly this is about building capacity within the NDC focal point, and so that might be things such as understanding of the Paris Agreement and the international climate negotiations, or it could be expertise in project management tools and techniques, such as critical path analysis, risk registers and Gantt charts, etc. But it will also be about building capacity in the other stakeholders and institutions that will be involved in NDC implementation. And also importantly could involve improving institutional memory within the institutions. The next activity is engaging external stakeholders and could involve a stakeholder mapping exercise, agreeing roles and responsibilities for engaging with stakeholders, and setting this out in a stakeholder engagement plan. And then the last activity is around consideration of legal frameworks. So it is possible that some countries might choose to put in place legislation in the way that's been done in Kenya, for example, and this legislation could perform a number of functions on NDC implementation. It could provide a mandate for the central coordination team, it could set out roles and responsibilities, it could provide powers to obtain data, and it could formalize decision-making processes. The next module is mitigation, and obviously mitigation can take place at a range of different levels, national level, local level, even the regional level across a number of different countries. And also it can be delivered through a range of options such as regulations, standards, information and labelling, fiscal incentives and so on. And key to all of this is nationally appropriate mitigation actions, or NAMAs, that a number of countries are developing. So the first activity set out in the guide on mitigation is around considering the institutional arrangements for coordination and oversight of mitigation activities. And this obviously links closely with the governance module. The next activity is about analysing national level mitigation potential to help identify priority mitigation actions. So this would involve collecting data on abatement potential and cost. Where that data is not available domestically, you could use international benchmarks, and coming up with a long list of different mitigation options across the different sectors. And moving on from that, then the country might want to shortlist those measures and prioritise them based on agreed criteria, such as the cost of the measures, the mitigation potential, the technical feasibility, or the co-benefits. The country might also want to undertake a barriers analysis to understand what might prevent the mitigation actions from being delivered. And then it might want to develop some and model some greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. So it could look at a business as usual scenario and one or a number of mitigation scenarios that are based on packages of different mitigation measures. The next activity is to start looking at the sectoral level and appraise the sectoral mitigation actions and start thinking about developing a sectoral action plan. Next is to design the mitigation policies themselves and to consider arrangements for ongoing implementation. And when designing these mitigation policies, it's of course important to consider all the potential co-benefits, but also links with the Sustainable Development Goals. The next activity is to access financing for mitigation activities, and this is covered in more detail in the climate finance module in the guide. And after that, the next activity is to implement the mitigation policies on the ground, to build capacity and to support through guidance. The next activity is to track progress, and this is covered more in the MRV module. but essentially involves monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness and the impacts of the different mitigation policies. And finally, the final activity might be to start preparing for future NDCs. And so countries might want to start thinking about strengthening greenhouse gas emissions targets in the future, or possibly expanding those targets to cover more sectors if they don't already cover the whole economy. The next module is adaptation, and this is obviously a priority for many countries, in particular least developed countries and small island developing states that are already experiencing severe climate impacts. The adaptation module is very much built around the UNFCCC National Adaptation Plan process, or the NAP process. So if the NDC sets out what a country plans to do on adaptation, the NAP process is really about the how that will be achieved. And so therefore it makes sense to align NDC implementation on adaptation with that NAP process. The first activity in this module is to undertake groundwork and governance, and this links with element A of the NAP technical guidelines. And this includes stock taking to identify the available information on impacts and vulnerabilities and to assess gaps. The next activity is to undertake preparatory work for adaptation plans, and this links with element B of the NAP technical guidelines. And it includes things such as analysing current and future climate change scenarios, assessing climate vulnerabilities, and appraising adaptation options and costs. The next activity under the adaptation module is to access financing for adaptation actions, and this is again covered in more detail in the finance module. Next we have implementing the actions, the policies, the projects and the programs, and this links to element C of the NAP technical guidelines and covers issues such as how to prioritize climate change adaptation in national policy, how to develop a long-term national adaptation implementation strategy, and how to enhance capacity for national adaptation actions. And the final activity under this module is to monitor and report on progress and effectiveness of the adaptation actions that are being put in place. And this links with element D of the NAP guidelines. And it covers monitoring the process, reviewing progress, and iteratively updating the national adaptation plan accordingly. The next module is the finance module, and again this is a really critical issue for NDC implementation to ensure sufficient financing for the mitigation and adaptation activities. Many NDCs do contain some information on finance support needs, but often it's not in sufficient detail to represent investment strategies. So many countries are thinking about developing a climate investment plan. And a climate investment plan really sets out in more detail the program of investments that are needed to implement the NDC and also a strategy for meeting those financing needs. So the first activity under the finance module again is around institutional arrangements. So this involves setting up or setting the roles and responsibilities on climate finance, including a central coordination team for climate finance whose functions would include planning and coordinating the access, mobilization, disbursement and tracking of climate finance. So that could be the Ministry of Finance or it could be Ministry of Environment or other institutions. This activity around institutional arrangements could also involve mainstreaming climate change into national budget processes. The next activity is to compile overall costings for the NDC. And this would involve costing individual actions and checking these costing estimates with experts. The next step is to identify the funding gaps and needs for NDC implementation. So this is covered a little bit by the mitigation and adaptation modules, but it would essentially involve scoping and prioritizing the mitigation and adaptation actions, assessing the funding status of those actions, and in particular what the funding gaps are, and identifying the level and type of support needed. The next activity under this module is to assess public and private financing options. So this could involve assessing the potential for further domestic support for all the actions, which could entail greening existing activities. It also involves assessing eligibility of the different actions against any bilateral and multilateral funding sources. And also it can involve assessing the options for private sector investment in each action. So, for example, what is the attractiveness to the private sector of the mitigation or adaptation action in question? Will the action generate a predictable future revenue stream? The next action is to develop a climate investment plan, consolidating the analysis done in the previous activities. The next activity under this module would be to consider the scope for securing direct access to international climate finance, which is possible under some funds such as the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Fund. And the next activity after that is to start developing a project pipeline and specific financing propositions. The next activity is to increase the private sector engagement. And so this could involve identifying the barriers to private sector investment. So are there credit risks or technical risks or policy risks? And it would then involve identifying potential interventions to address those barriers, and also perhaps strengthening capacity within government to identify and develop viable financing opportunities for the private sector. And the final activity in this module is to design and implement a climate finance MRV system to track the financial flows, and I'll come on to that more in the next slide. So this next slide is about the final module, the MRV, Measurement, Reporting and Verification, and this is also known as transparency under the Paris Agreement. So this can mean many things. The Paris Agreement talks about it in terms of providing information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving the NDC. Again, that's quite broad, and it could cover mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance. So on mitigation, it can mean assessing progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that can both be done looking at previous emissions under the greenhouse gas inventory, or it could also mean looking ahead to future greenhouse gas emissions by developing some greenhouse gas projections. The mitigation element of transparency, or MRV, could also include monitoring and evaluating individual mitigation actions to understand their impacts and effectiveness. Similarly, for adaptation, transparency would mean monitoring and evaluating adaptation actions to understand the impacts they've had. And for finance, transparency really means tracking incoming climate finance flows, both international and national, private and public, and also looking at where these are going, what projects and programs they're being spent on, and what impacts these projects and programs are having. So the first activity under this module is, again, setting up the relevant institutional arrangements. This could mean setting up an MRV steering group. It could also involve agreeing the overall lead for MRV and developing rules and guidance, for example, on data sharing. It's also important as part of this to think about the plans for reporting. So who is the audience, what is the format and frequency of the reporting? And as part of that, it's really important to always remember the domestic audience, the domestic stakeholders. The next activity is to assess data gaps and needs, and really this is about considering how existing MRV systems might be extended to address gaps. And I think that's an important point, because not many countries have a dedicated MRV system for climate change or for its NDC, but there are likely to be a number of different reporting streams where information is collected and reported to different audiences, and a lot of that could be used for transparency under the NDC. The next activity is to design the MRV system for mitigation, adaptation and climate finance, and these are covered in those respective modules in more detail. The next activity in this module is around data management and establishing appropriate data management processes. So this could mean developing systems to improve data quality, such as independent verification, internal QA and auditing. It can also involve developing data management systems such as appropriate data archiving. And it could involve assessing data gaps and developing some kind of data improvement plan, which could be part of the NDC implementation plan or a standalone one. And that should really look at an appropriate stepwise process for improving the evidence base and data. The next activity under this module is to build capacity for MRV, and this will obviously cover both all of mitigation, adaptation and finance, but also capacity around data management, maybe some capacity and expertise on UNFCCC reporting requirements, and perhaps capacity for drafting memoranda of understanding or legal documents that can define data sharing arrangements. And the final activity under this module is to improve the system over time, because there is a process of continuous improvement for all MRV systems. So that's just hopefully given you quite a quick overview and flavour of the content of the different manuals. There's different modules, sorry. There's obviously a lot more information in the guide itself, so I'd encourage you to go away and look at it in more detail. But for now, I'll hand back over to Claire.
Great, thank you, James. And I'd like to welcome Stephen to the webinar. So welcome, Stephen Kongu, and invite you to respond, and also say a little bit, if you can, about...
Thank you, Claire. I hope I can do that.
Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Claire, and I'm happy to participate, of course, for the next few minutes, of course, in the webinar. I'll be very quick because at least we are working with CDKN on the NDC Quick Start Guide, and therefore I will just share with the participants our own perspective of the benefits of course, participating in the NDC Quick Start Guide for at least at the country level. So I'm happy that, of course, the last slide that Harries presented was on the MRV component, because that's where the Kenyan project component focuses. We said because that's where perhaps we feel that the NDC Quick Start Guide can help us, we'll focus only on the section on MRV, measuring, reporting, and verification. And of course, this we built. Yep, this builds on work that, of course, that we have done. We already have a national performance and benefit measuring framework, which we variously also refer to as an MRV plus system. It's an MRV plus system because it does not just look at mitigation numbers only, but it also looks at, of course, synergies between mitigation and adaptation actions, and also looks at other socioeconomic benefits like job creation, health benefits, of course, poverty alleviation, among others. Of course, the list is inexhaustible, but obviously, from a practical perspective, one cannot look at all those. So for Kenya, the NDC Quick Start Guide will focus mainly on reviewing the key MRV actions outlined in our National Climate Change Action Plan, in our NDC, and also, of course, in our Climate Change Act, because we now have a Climate Change Act that our President signed into law in May last year, and it's already operational, and we are starting, of course, to implement that in a small way. And part of what is anchored in that law is the national MRV system, of course. That first and foremost responds, of course, to national reporting needs, and then at the secondary level, of course, responds then to our international obligation and the UNFCCC, of course, for reporting. So we'll start on that, build on the, of course, review the actions proposed in the 3 documents, and then prioritize, of course, the MRV actions, and then, of course, with a view to coming up, of course, with an NDC implementation plan with respect, of course, to the MRV aspects. One of the advantages that we foresee, of course, in this work is to learn, of course, first and foremost, of course, to learn from the gap analysis, because part of the work, of course, will include the gap analysis on the MRV actions, and then, of course, also to learn from other participating countries. And I'm aware, of course, that in Africa we have 2 other countries, Zambia and Uganda, participating, and we are happy, of course, to learn from them, and also to share lessons, of course, accruing from our own work with them. Allow me also to mention, of course, a different perspective, because of course, even the participants saw in the program that I was said to be the LETS GP co-chair, and I think from the perspective especially of the African chapter of the LETS GP, which is the Africa LETS Partnership, there is also a lot of interlinkage, of course, between the NDC Quick Start Guide and the work, of course, or the vision of the regional platform for Africa, And of course, we want first and foremost, of course, also to investigate the interlinkages between low emission development strategies and NDCs, of course, knowing that, of course, NDCs are centrally to deliver on the mitigation component and the Paris Agreement. And in the objectives of the African-led partnership, of course, I can just share with you very quickly, of course, one of the objectives is to promote information exchange and coordination among low emission development programs, low emission development strategies programs and country institutions to cultivate and support led champions in Africa. And lastly, which I think is of most relevance, of course, to this work, to enhance capacity for design and implementation of LEDs in Africa. And of course, one of the ways that we can do that, of course, is also contributing towards, through low emission development strategies, towards the implementation of NDCs, especially, of course, the mitigation component of NDCs. We implement, of course, our mandate as the Africa-led partnership, of course, through several initiatives that, of course, includes also through the work of technical working groups. And of course, those who are interested in the, of course, among the participants who are here today can access our website and see what, of course, they can find relevant. And then also the other way is through the initiatives that we are undertaking. And I would just want to mention one that I think is very relevant, of course, to what we are discussing here today. We have an Africa-led partnership led modeling support or support work to several countries, of course, through the support of the EU. And this, of course, will support the implementation of Article 3, which is ideally the NDC article of the Paris Agreement. And of course, a part of what it will deliver is to select a model from a long list of course, modeling suits, of course, to what is relevant for a country. And that one of the countries, again, benefiting from that work is my own country, Kenya. And therefore, this, of course, will plow into decision making in matters of course, of implementation of INDC and other low emission development strategies, of course, being mainstreamed in decision making processes, because this, we think, is the way to go, because until we mainstream low emission development strategies or mitigation actions into normal development, then it might not see the light of the day. Let me pause at that point so that then I can perhaps react to any questions perhaps after the participants have digested just what I've said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really great to hear about how you're approaching it in Kenya. We do have a question actually that's just come in that is specifically for you, and it's how do you manage to maintain the momentum of involved stakeholders to achieve your objectives?
You want me to answer it now? Yeah?
Yes, please.
Can I do it now?
Please do, yes.
Thank you very much. I think there is no miracle for maintaining the momentum, of course, of stakeholders. And of course, to maintain that momentum, you will first have to have, of course, obtained or gotten the buy-in of the stakeholders. And I think one of the secrets that we have discovered along the way is first and foremost to realize or to recognize the fact that every stakeholder is important and relevant. They might not be relevant, of course, using the same dimensions or the same measure, because every stakeholder will have a role to play, will have a stake in the process, and we need to give them that space, of course, to play that rightful role. And one of the ways, of course, we have mastered is to treat every stakeholder as important, because stakeholders are people. And people have got feelings, and we can tell everybody that they are important, but the treatment we give them, sometimes the partiality that we show them as we interact with the different stakeholders, of course, tells a totally different story. So we treat our stakeholders with the highest degree of caution and care and respect, because everyone deserves respect. Two, we try, of course, to sensitize every stakeholder category so that they clearly understand their roles, and they also understand the roles of other stakeholders, and also to bring to the fore the very important fact that the roles of the different stakeholders are not competitive but complementary. And this to us is very important because when then we integrate the different efforts and inputs of the different stakeholders, then we come up with a wholesome impact, which would not have been attained if we only concentrated on one sector of stakeholders at the expense of others. And to us, this is very important. I just imagine that perhaps it's part of the game. I cannot perhaps go into more details of discussions of how best to treat stakeholders. But we must recognize that every stakeholder has got a role, otherwise then they are not stakeholders, and we need to give them the space to play that role. But then we also need to sensitize them to recognize that they are not alone. They must also accommodate other stakeholders, and it's that integrated output of the different stakeholders that makes of course, that maintains the momentum, and that ensures, of course, that the impact at the of course in the long run can be felt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And actually linked to that, how do you involve the subnational government? So in Kenya, clearly you have a number of counties. How do you involve them in the process? Are you able to respond to that, Stephen? Okay, we'll come back to that one, Stephen, but if you're able to, the question was around how you make links with your kind of your county. We have some other questions that have been coming through, so I'm going to work through as many of those as we can. First of all, James, what are the specific laws and policies for different countries that require planning for NDC implementation? And I think there are perhaps two ways you can interpret this question. Firstly, what would you need to be in place in order to implement the NDC itself? And secondly, what laws and policies might be expected to be impacted?
Okay, so thanks, Claire. So I think just taking the first sort of interpretation of that question, I mean, and so what laws and policies would need to be in place to implement the NDC, I think it really does depend on the country context. So each country will obviously have different priorities, different priority sectors, and will have different needs in terms of the kinds of mitigation and adaptation measures that they implement. In terms of laws, then I think this is really one key option, as I mentioned in the governance module, that a country might want to consider whether it should introduce some kind of climate law, some kind of NDC law to really formalise a lot of the structures and arrangements that should be put in place for NDC implementation. In terms of what laws and policies are expected to be impacted by the NDC, that's a slightly different question. And I mean, I think, again, it depends on the country context, but I do think that ultimately a really key aim for all of this is to mainstream and integrate NDC implementation into existing processes. And so where there are sectoral master plans or 5-year development plans, the ultimate aim should be to try and get NDC implementation really embedded within that. Now, that's not easy to do, and you can't necessarily do that overnight. And I think in many cases countries might take a pragmatic approach whereby they develop standalone NDC implementation roadmaps or NDC sectoral action plans for the time being, use that process to really build capacity, to improve engagement with other non-climate related ministries and to sort of improve their engagement and buy-in, and over time use that as a sort of springboard to much more full mainstreaming and embedding of the NDC process.
Thank you. And can you say a little bit about how other countries are starting to make progress towards implementing their NDCs? For example, have they been incorporating NDCs into energy, agriculture, policy, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few words about some of the projects we've been involved in. So we're currently doing supporting governments in Bangladesh, Nigeria and Myanmar to develop NDC implementation plans. And in particular, Bangladesh and Nigeria are very much taking a sectoral approach. So they're developing sectoral action plans for the sectors that are covered by the NDC, and these action plans set out the key challenges, priorities and specific actions for those sectors. And as far as possible, we've been trying to come up with quite a detailed list or table of activities showing what activities have to be done, when they have to be done by, who's the responsible owner for that activity, and if possible some kind of estimate of resources needed for that sort of activity. So I think that will probably be an approach that a lot of countries do choose to take, to go down the sectoral plan approach. In Bangladesh, where I've been working, we have been liaising with the sectoral stakeholders and thinking about the existing sectoral master plans, but in many cases those are not necessarily up for review, so the interim step is to have this standalone NDC sectoral plan. But as I say, over time I expect more and more for the NDC implementation process just to become embedded in these wider sectoral master plans.
Great, thank you. And linked to that as well, a question around, has the NDC guided budget formulation? I mean, I propose that that's possibly too early for that a bit to have been the case yet, but that's not to say that national climate change policy hasn't influenced budget allocation prior to now. And Kenya, for example, the new Act has statements in there around the new council on the development of a national climate change action plan, requiring that to be incorporated into budgets of each state department and other national government entities. So there is evidence, I think, of that starting to happen, and others may be aware of more. The next question we have is, how and where does the guide integrate mitigation and adaptation?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we took the approach in the guide to follow this NDC implementation framework, which has separate mitigation and adaptation modules, but we also sort of, in doing that, recognized the risk that we didn't want people to think in a sort of silo mentality. So I mean, the guide does encourage the user to think about these mitigation adaptation synergies or win-win measures, the ones that can help strengthen climate resilience but also at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, I mean, one of the ways that this can be integrated into the NDC implementation planning process is to actually include that as one of the criteria for shortlisting your measures. So I mentioned for the mitigation module the process of developing a long list of mitigation options across all the different sectors and then whittling that down to a short list using some criteria. And I think it's really, really important if for one of those criteria to be the adaptation benefits or the climate resilience benefits. And so that way you automatically, from the start, build adaptation into your mitigation work, and you can do vice versa when looking at your national adaptation plan as well. So I think it's just a matter of looking for those kinds of opportunities to really formalize the kind of mitigation adaptation links in the process that you're carrying out.
Great, thank you. I have a question now that's more specifically about the city level. So what are the existing approaches and available studies that give an insight into the potentials and the barriers of NDC implementation at the city level?
Yeah, okay, so I mean there are some initiatives currently going on at the sort of looking at the subnational level around climate change. A lot of them are focused on sort of recording actions. So there, for example, there's the UNFCCC NASCA platform, which is trying to record city level climate change actions. But I mean, obviously that's really important and really, really useful and helps transparency, but I guess recording the actions doesn't necessarily sort of encourage vertical integration in and of itself. I think to do that, the really critical issue is around data and having a consistent approach to measuring the impacts of measures at the city level and at the national level. And I think, you know, to do that, cities are, for example, being encouraged to join the Compact of Mayors, and a requirement of doing that is that they follow the GPC, the Global Protocol on Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventories. Bit of a mouthful, but basically it's the sort of methodologies and rules that have been set for developing community level and city level greenhouse gas inventories. And in theory, in doing this, it would mean that there would be a sort of seamless integration between the national level greenhouse gas inventory and the city level greenhouse gas inventory. And I think once you've cracked that issue and cracked the kind of data consistency issue, then it becomes a lot easier to start thinking about vertical alignment, because you're much more confident in your evidence base. You understand a bit more about double counting and where you might be duplicating emissions impacts. So I think really a key step is around developing that consistency and approach on measurement, reporting and verification as is being done through the GPC. There are quite a lot of other resources out there around climate action at the subnational level and integrating it with national level work. I won't go through all those now, but we'd be happy to send you some links after this presentation. So there's, I think there's a paper by C40, there's some work being done by the LEDS Global Partnership looking at vertical integration between cities and national level. So there are some good resources out there, and we'll aim to send you some links.
Great, thanks James. Can I just see if Stephen is still online? If so, Stephen, there are a couple of questions that would be great to put to you. Stephen, can you hear us? No, okay. Sorry about that. What we can do?
Claire?
Oh, great, Stephen, brilliant. I have two questions for you, if that's okay. One was around how the NDC has been approached in Kenya at the subnational level. How are you managed to kind of do that? And secondly, how are you coordinating NDC implementation across government? Who's doing that? How is that being done?
Okay. Do I get the two questions and I can respond?
Yes, please do.
Okay, I think then in terms of how we are managing the coordination of NDC implementation, one, of course, we have established, of course, working rapports across the different sectors, of course, within the national government. We have got 47 county governments and one national government, and therefore in total, of course, it's a complicated equation of 48 semi-autonomous governments, of course, that are supposed to work together, collaborate together, of course, to deliver both the national objectives and the county objectives. Across the national government, of course, we have over the years established working relationships with the relevant offices in the ministries, departments, and agencies. And we have, of course, since the dawn of the new dispensation now, where we started having operationalizing our devolved government system in 2013 after the elections, we have also established working rapports, of course, with the different county governments through an entity called the Council of Governors, because every county government is headed by a governor, and they have a unifying body, of course, a unifying sort of body or forum for governors called the Council of Governors. And we have a Council of Governors Secretariat, so we have a conduct at the Secretariat, and we also have conduct, of course, at the political level, where we deal with the governors themselves or their ministers. And that has worked well for us. So the actual implementation is done by either the sector actors or the the relevant county offices. But then our mandate as a climate change directorate for the whole country is to coordinate those efforts to ensure, one, of course, cross-sectoral integration and, of course, integration between or synthesis between what the national government is doing and what the county governments are doing. And therefore, I will just go back again to what I said during as I was responding to my very first question. We have created space for the county governments, and this, thank God, now it's anchored in the Climate Change Act, where then there is a clear direction, of course, or clear obligations given to the national government, of course, through their entities, ministries, departments, and agencies, and the clear mandates, of course, on the implementation, of course, given to the county governments. And us as we have a National Climate Change Council at the top, where we come in as a Climate Change Directorate the technical arm of that council, so that we can coordinate across the different sectors. And that's our institutional setup in a nutshell. Of course, I cannot share too much because of time. But then what we have done, I will just, that's why I was going back now to my first response, is to create space for each of those actors, because by law, they are recognized, because they have got a role to play. And we are still perfecting that, of course, because we are experimenting with the devolved government system, of course, for the first time since 1963 when we got our independence. And of course, we are learning by doing, but I think so far we are doing well. We have not had issues, very significant issues.
Great, thank you, Stephen. That's really interesting, really interesting to hear how it's all been approached in Kenya, so thank you so much for that response. James, you also wanted to add something about the coordination, the NDC implementation.
Yeah, no, just one of the questions is about who should be doing this coordination function, and as I mentioned briefly earlier, I mean, often it is the Environment Ministry that has a central coordinating role on climate change and would probably do the same for NDC implementation. But I do think it's worth thinking creatively about this as well, because there are other approaches. And I mean, for example, if one of the things you really want to do is to try and encourage political buy-in at the highest level, then you could think about situating the coordinating team within a Prime Minister's office, for example, if such an office exists. If you're keen on mainstreaming the NDC implementation process into development policy, and there's a 5-year plan process, then whoever's responsible for that 5-year plan process, you could house the coordination team there, be it some kind of planning commission. So I just think it's worth thinking about what you want to achieve, what your priorities are, and you know, don't just assume it would necessarily be the Environment Ministry. There are other options out there.
Thanks, James. And just finally, if you could give us a very quick response before we wrap up. A question here about how the guide and manual could actually be used in my country.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think, I mean, I covered some of that in the slides already, in the sense that the main use for this guide is to really help support countries as they develop NDC implementation plans and roadmaps. But I think there are potentially other uses for it as well. And I mean, one example is that we have used the guide in a kind of workshop setting in some countries, where we can run a 1 or 2 day workshop using the guide as a kind of framework for the whole session, and using the guide to have interactive group sessions with different teams to carry out stock taking, understand what's been done already, what the next steps and priorities are. So there are a sort of few different uses. It can be used for kind of engaging with stakeholders, or it can also just be used in a wider project to help develop an NDC implementation plan.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm afraid it's now time to close the webinar. Thank you all for taking the time to join. I hope it's been useful. Thanks to James and Stephen for your contributions. We will be putting a recording of this and the slides on the website soon on cdkn.org. You can also find the guide online there and in PDF format, so I'd encourage you to have a look there. And please do contact myself or James if we can be of any help. So thanks again for joining. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you very much.